Welcome. Hi, my name is Pamela Arya, proud parent of Adam White 2018, so he'll be graduating this June, and I'm class of '84.
And my name is Isabel Martin. I'm the class of 2018, and we would like to welcome all of you, students, families, alumni, and friends, to the Pembroke Center's Family Weekend program, Vulnerable Families in the Unchanging Economy, with Professor Aizer and Drew Walker, the Pembroke Center's Associate Director and Director of Gender and Sexuality Studies.
Today's program is sponsored by the Pembroke Center Associates, a group of alums, students, parents, and friends who support the Pembroke Center. I'm pleased to be a member of this generous group and to serve on its council. Pembroke Center plays a unique role at Brown University. It was founded in 1981 and is named in honor of the Pembroke College in Brown University and on the woman of Pembroke and its predecessor, the Women's College.
The Pembroke Center is home to Brown's Gender and Sexuality Studies concentration, which I will be receiving my degree in next May with comparative literature. And it is also a nationally and internationally recognized academic institution that does research and teaching about social change and how questions of difference, such as gender, race, class, and religion, affect our thinking and our world. The center supports students, faculties, and scholars with fellowships, as well as research grants for Brown faculty and students doing innovative work in a wide variety of disciplines. I am thrilled to be an undergraduate fellow in this year's Pembroke Center's research seminar, Cultures of Pacifism.
The Pembroke Center is also proud to curate and maintain the Christine Dunlap Farnham Archive and the Feminist Theory Archive that preserve the history of Brown and Rhode Island women and the intellectual history of feminist scholars. Both are unique collections, are important resources for scholars around the world. There's a Pembroke Center information on the table, and we invite you to visit our website, to follow us on social media, and to learn about our programs, activities, and research. Thank you for joining us, and we invite you to stay afterwards to enjoy refreshments and conversation.
And before we get started, we ask you to please turn off your cell phones. Thanks to Associate Director Drew Walker for leading our conversation today, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Aizer. Anna Aizer is Professor of Economics and Public Policy here at Brown. She received her PhD in Economics from UCLA in 2003 and came to Brown in 2004 after a postdoctoral fellowship at Princeton University's Center for Research on Child Well-Being. She is also co-director of the National Bureau of Economic Research's Program on Children. She is a labor and health economist with interests in the area of child health and well-being, and her current work considers the mechanisms behind the intergenerational transmission of poverty. She is the first woman to be tenured in the economics department at Brown. And please join us in welcoming Professor Aizer.
Okay, thank you all for coming. This is gonna proceed by way of a discussion between me and Anna, Professor Aizer. And I wanted just to say a little bit about where this conversation came together between Professor Aizer and the Pembroke Center. Last year, in the aftermath of the presidential campaign, Professor Aizer got in touch with us at the Pembroke Center to coordinate a panel for undergraduate students on the importance of data-driven research for social and political life. And so that began some of these conversations between her work in economics and our work at the Pembroke Center. And as we were discussing today how the conversation would proceed, we decided to begin with some data on the gender pay gap and then turn to some of the specific work that Professor Aizer does in relation to questions of intergenerational effects of poverty, particularly on women and children. So with that, I just want to start with the basic question: what is the gender pay gap now, and how's it been changing over time?
Glad you asked that question, Drew. So the gender pay gap is basically about 20 cents on the dollar. Right? So what I'm showing you here is just a trend over time in women's pay relative to men's pay. So we would be at parity at 100. As you can see, so this is just sort of two ways of showing it. One is using annual full-time earnings, the other is using weekly wages. This is limited to all full-time workers, okay? And what you can see is now we're at about 80 cents on the dollar, but this has changed significantly over time. So if I go down to 1970 about, we are at between 60 and 63 cents on the dollar, right? So we've seen tremendous progress between then and now, but we are still not at parity.
And so one of the things that people often ask about this too is how the U.S. compares to other nations with similarly developed economies.
Right. So what I can show you is information from other OECD countries. Now the way they've measured it is different. Now what is on the vertical axis is the gap. Right? So the larger that number, the bigger the gap. And so you can see the average for OECD countries is about 18%. If you look at the US, we're at something like 22. Right? So we're not the worst, but we're certainly not the best. There's tremendous work to be done. There are some countries on there that might be a little bit sort of non-intuitive. Sweden, for example, has a wage gap that's really quite similar to ours, which is somewhat surprising. If you look at a place like Italy, I don't think many people thought that that would be a country. There would be more parity, but it seems that there is. There's also much lower female labor force participation in Italy than there is in the US. So in Italy, only about 40% of women are working. In the US, it's closer to about 65%.
So one of the things we teach at Pembroke Center, we spend a lot of time teaching feminist movements historically and thinking about feminist theory and also the political life of feminist work. And so one of the things that comes to mind, of course, is whether or not this has gotten better or worse over time in the U.S. and elsewhere.
Right. So clearly, we are converging, and there's a number of reasons why we are converging. I would say that the number one reason is the increases in female educational attainment. Right? So that's really been tremendous. I can show you this graph here. This is the share of women who have a college degree in the U.S. relative to men. And you can see if you go all the way back to about 1967, right? Women, looks like about 12% of women had a college degree. And if you look at men, it's a little bit higher than that, a little under 20%. Over time, you see that women are completely taken over in this respect, right? So starting somewhere in the mid-90s, women started actually increasing relative to men in terms of the number of women who had a bachelor's degree or higher. So this is probably one of the most important reasons behind this convergence in the pay gap, which is women are just getting more skilled over time. Yes?
What is the actual percentage in the population that equalize for numbers in the population?
Well, so this is, I'm not sure I totally understand your question, but we're looking at young people. So this is between the ages of 25 and 29. So if I were to look at the whole population, it might still be the case that fewer women have a college degree relative to men because we still have older cohorts.
In the population, what percent of the population is women, what percent is men? Is that
It is about 50-50. It's about 50-50 in the US, yes. That's correct. Women do have slightly longer life expectancies, but there are more boys being born. Sort of evens out. Yeah.
Is the pay gap, you said that it's shrinking because women are more educated, so when you talk about the pay gap, it's regardless of position, it's not the same.
That's a very good question. So, in fact, if I break the pay gap out by education, right? So I look at people without a high school degree and people with a college degree or more, the pay gap is about the same within those two groups. It's very interesting. There are some groups for whom the pay gap is smaller. The pay gap is actually smaller for African American and Latinos. And that's it's about 90 cents for them, 90%. And that's for two reasons. So black women and Latinas are doing better, but also black men and Latino men are doing slightly worse. So kind of a combination of things. But yes, if you look now, the pay gap is the same within educational groups.
Right, so that's one of the questions that I think a lot of people have is if these things are converging, especially around education, then why are we still not equal? And what, is it a matter about occupations? Like
Yeah,
what is it?
yeah. Well, so let me just say a couple other things about the convergence before I get to that question. So a number of other things are also sort of related to that convergence over time. You see, I don't know if there are people here who remember, there was sort of a major revolution in the sense of contraception coverage starting in the 60s, right? Oral contraception became available, and IUDs soon after that. And a lot of economists have actually looked at the relationship between access to oral contraception and educational attainment and labor force participation, and there was clearly a very strong connection there. The ability to time your fertility allowed women to finish their education, continue their education, and enter the labor force on sort of different terms than they were before. So that's an important part of this story as well. Some other things to note is part of the story actually more recently is the decline in unionization, as you might not think of that, but you know, many years ago, 20, 30 years ago, about 30 to 35% of workers were unionized. Now that number is something like 10 or 11%. And what that has done is that has actually pushed down the wages of men. So part of the closing of the gap is men are doing slightly less well than they were previously. Another part of the story, which is harder to sort of quantify, is an increase in competition. And when things get more competitive, discrimination tends to decline. And that's because discrimination is very expensive for us. I mean, if you think about it, what discrimination means is that you are not necessarily choosing the most productive worker because you have some distaste for women or for African Americans or for Latinos, in which case you're essentially sacrificing profits. So if there's another firm that doesn't have that same kind of distaste, they will hire those more productive workers and they will essentially run you out of the market. So as the US has gotten more competitive, you've also sort of seen discrimination, not only against women, but against other groups, also fall over time. So all of those kind of are reasons why we're seeing the gap falling, but it has still not converged. And you know, the question is, what is that? And to sort of, to answer that question requires a little bit of, call it detective work. And so one thing you might do is sort of think, well, maybe it's about occupations, right? So maybe there's still occupational segregation, and it's the fact that women are moving into lower paying occupations. That only explains about 15% of the pay gap. The remaining 85% of the pay gap actually exists within occupations. So this is the next slide here. If you can see this, this is not all occupations. This is just like a smattering of different occupations. There's truck drivers, hand laborers and material movers, software developers, food service managers, designers, financial managers, et cetera. And the blue dot is the male median wages, and the orange dot is female median wages. And what you can see is that within occupation, there are these huge differences in pay, and they're bigger in some occupations than others. And the occupations in which they are the largest are those occupations in which there's a premium paid on long, inflexible hours. So these are jobs where, for example, you would be paid more than, for an 80-hour work week, you would be paid more than 2 times a 40-hour work week. So there's this huge premium being paid for people who are willing to work long hours with very inflexible schedules. And those are sort of predominantly in finance and banking and law, right? So that's where you're seeing huge divergence within occupation in terms of the pay of men and women. And I'll tell you I'll just describe some research that was done by an economist at the University of Chicago and Harvard, Marion Bertrand and Claudia Golden. They had this really great data on alumni from Chicago Booth. That's the business school at the University of Chicago. It's an excellent business school, one of the top ones in the country. And they had this wonderful data for all their alums who graduated between 1990 and 2006. And the beauty of this data is they had information on their experience, on their grades in every class, and so they could really compare apples to apples, right? So they could take 2 alums who did similarly well in school with a similar background and look to see what their earnings were over the course of their lifetime after they graduated. And what they found is that in the first 5 years after graduation, the pay gap between men and women was less than 5%. right? So in the first 5 years, they're earning about the same. Within about 12 to 15 years, the pay gap was 36%, right? So it really, really opened up. And if you look at this slide here, what I'm showing you here is the pay gap by age, right? And so it's kind of consistent with that story I just told you. So when you first look at this graph here, and you see that the pay gap is larger for slightly older women, so women between the ages of 35 and, say, 55, much higher, much greater than it is for younger women. That can be for two reasons. One, those older women have fewer years of schooling. Right? We know that more and more. It's younger women who are really who are more highly educated relative to men now. But a big piece of this is also what's happening as women enter the labor force, right? Their pay tends to decline right around child rearing, right? Probably not surprising. It's very difficult to maintain a career and raise children at the same time, particularly if your job requires long or inflexible hours. So that is certainly part of the story in terms of why we still have a pay gap. It's just working hard and making lots of money can sometimes be incompatible with raising children.
You mentioned discrimination earlier, though, thinking about the way that I guess when you have a more competitive marketplace, discrimination can seem to go down. But how is it that economists are able to account for discrimination? Like, how does it figure into the story?
That's a great question. It's very hard to measure discrimination. So what we typically do is we say, okay, let's look at the pay gap and let's use all the data we have to try to explain differences in wages. And everything that we can't explain will kind of chalk up to discrimination. And that tends to be that 8%. That's not a very satisfying solution, but it's kind of the best that we have given data limitations. There have been some studies that have looked at discrimination sort of head on, and I'll just mention one of them here. This was a paper that was written by an economist at Princeton, C.C. Rouse, and again, Claudia Golden at Harvard. And what they were looking at was professional musicians, right? So it used to be that professional orchestras were almost entirely male. And that started changing in the 90s and 2000s. Increasingly more women were joining professional orchestras. And what they did was they looked at one thing. They looked at an orchestra's decision to go to blind auditions. So it used to be to an audition for a professional orchestra, you would come up on a stage, you would play your instrument, and the jury would be sitting in the audience, and they would decide whether or not you would receive a place in the orchestra. At some point, they decided to put a screen in front of the musician, right? It's an incredibly simple thing to do. But now it was a blind audition. And when that happened, they started hiring a lot more women, right? So just putting this screen in front of the musician basically explained about 25% of the increase in female musicians in orchestras. And that really can't be anything other than discrimination. I mean, there's really no other viable story for that. So when we do measure discrimination, there is evidence that it exists, and there can sometimes be very simple ways to reduce it.
I wonder to what extent people are putting up screens of other kinds of application processes, whether it's possible.
Right, that's right.
Okay, you want to switch gears a little bit?
Sure.
Think a little bit more. So we've talked about the pay gap a bit, and want to think about some of the other implications around the pay gap and the intergenerational transmission of poverty. We're leaving out the question of intergenerational transmission of wealth for now, which may be more obvious. Professor Aizer's research in particular has looked at a lot of the factors around this, so we're going to delve into that for a bit. So just again, to ask a very simple question to start, what are some of the implications of an inferior economic status of women inside and outside the market?
Okay, so it's incredibly important. So again, most of my research is focused on children, and I would sort of argue that the economic status of women has very important implications for children's health and well-being. So in the U.S., most children, the vast majority of children, live with their mothers. About 2/3 of children, that's a little bit high, it's probably lower than that, live with their fathers. So it's not to say that fathers aren't important. Of course, they're incredibly important. But particularly if you're talking about poor children, the most disadvantaged children, really those kids are living primarily just with their mothers. And so the focus of most of my work is sort of understanding the experiences and the human capital accumulation of poor children, in which case we really need to understand moms and what's happening with them. And there is actually, the US is not a very mobile society. So if you look at the data, children who are born in the bottom 20% of the income distribution, and the vast majority of these kids are living with single mothers, and you compare them with children who are born to families in the top 20% of the income distribution, those poor kids are 8 times more likely to grow up to be in the bottom 20% of the income distribution than their richer counterparts, right? So there's really a lot, we refer to that as sort of immobility. And let me just show you here how the US compares in terms of both mobility and inequality with other OECD countries. So this is referred to as the Great Gatsby curve. And every point here is a different country. They're labeled. What we have on the x-axis is a measure of inequality. It's what we refer to as the Gini coefficient. And the higher the number, the more unequal the society. What we have on the vertical axis is what we refer to as the intergenerational earnings mobility elasticity. You can think of that as a correlation. The main thing to know is the higher that number, the more immobile the country. And so you see the US is kind of there in the middle, but more sort of into the upper right quadrant. We're pretty unequal and we're pretty immobile. I mean, we don't compare with Peru, Chile, Brazil, or Argentina. They are both more unequal and more immobile, but we're much worse off than, say, Finland, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Germany, Japan, France, Spain, New Zealand, Australia, and Canada when it comes to mobility, right? So the question is, why are we so immobile, right? And the way to sort of think about that, if you want to understand adult income, you really need to understand adult earnings. That's the vast majority of most people's income is just their earnings, right? And what makes somebody a higher earning is really largely a function of their human capital. What is their human capital? Your human capital is everything that makes you productive as a worker. So this includes your health, your physical health, your mental health, your cognitive achievement, sort of non-cognitive skills, like how hard you work, your soft skills. All these things make you a productive worker, and you earn more in the labor market if you are a more productive worker. And so basically what I do in almost all of my work is understand why it is that growing up poor or disadvantaged affects your human capital. And there are many ways in which growing up poor disadvantages you in terms of your productivity and your labor market outcomes, and I study a bunch of them.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Yeah, we'd love to hear what some of those things are.
Okay. Well, the first thing I'll talk about actually is the first research project I undertook here at Brown. And what I wanted to know is there a relationship between the pay gap and domestic violence? So domestic violence is pretty prevalent in the US. 24% of women will report that they have ever been the victim of domestic violence in their lifetimes. On average in the US, about 3 women are killed every day by their intimate partners. And if you look at the data, it is much more a poor woman's problem, right? So these rates of domestic violence are much higher among low-income women. And so the question is, does women's pay have anything to do with that? Is there a causal connection between women's lower rates of pay in the labor market and domestic violence? And so I'm going to take one quick aside to say, give a little plug to the Brown Economics Department. When I first arrived here in 2003, I said I was the only woman. There were no tenured women. There were not even any tenure-track women. And I thought this would be my first big project. This is what I was interested in studying in domestic violence and the economic determinants of domestic violence. And I was really nervous about this because They said there were no women here. They had always denied tenure to the few women that they had ever hired. I thought doing a gendered research project might not be such a smart idea. And one of my senior colleagues, very, very highly esteemed economist, took me to lunch one of my first weeks at Brown. And he said, well, what are you working on? What's your next big project going to be? Well, to tell you the truth, this is what I'm thinking. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is not going to go well. And he said, I think it's intellectually interesting and socially important, and you should absolutely do that. And for me, it was just a huge relief. And I have to say that even though I was one of 30 faculty, I was the only woman, I did feel very welcome at Brown, and they were very supportive of this research agenda, even though this is not what I had done in my dissertation. This is not what they thought they were hiring. But they were very supportive. And what I ended up doing in this was actually a set of papers. I wrote about 3 papers in this area. The first one was to sort of see, is there a link between the pay gap and domestic violence? And it's a very sort of simple economic model that you can sort of use to explain this relationship. We think about it in terms of bargaining. So, the idea is if I want to bargain with Brown for a higher wage, I go to them and I say I want a higher wage, and whether or not they give me one depends largely on what they think my outside option is. My outside option determines my bargaining power. So if they think I'm going to leave and go to Princeton, I'm much more likely to get a wage raise, right? If I don't really have any other good offers, they're probably not going to give me a wage raise because they don't think I'm going to leave, right? And so you can sort of apply that thinking regarding bargaining power and the outside option to a model of domestic violence, right? So the idea is if women can threaten to leave because their outside option is getting better because their labor market prospects are getting better, you might expect domestic violence to fall, either because she does actually leave or her threat to leave is now credible. And so so that was sort of the theory, and I took it to the data, and you actually did see a very strong relationship between the wage gap and rates of domestic violence, right? So as the wage gap shrinks, you see declines in domestic violence. I'll show you this here. Sorry, this only goes to about 2011. If you just focus, this comes from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. So this is just rates of intimate partner violence by gender. And you can see at the same time that the wage gap is falling, domestic violence against women, intimate partner violence, is also falling. And in fact, there is a causal relationship there, right? So that was sort of the first project in this research agenda. The second was then to link that with child health and well-being. So it is true that intimate partner violence often initiates or escalates when a woman is pregnant. And so what I did was I got some data from the state of California, which actually linked hospitalizations for women while they were pregnant with birth outcomes for their children. And so we could actually see the women who had been admitted to the hospital for an assault when they were pregnant. And what we found is that the birth outcomes of their children were much, much, much worse. So they were much more likely to be born premature, and they were much more likely to be born low birth weight. And those are 2 incredibly important predictors of later outcomes. So being born low birth weight predicts lower IQ, fewer years of schooling, and lower earnings in the labor market. It's an incredibly important predictor. And so basically what we're finding is that the children of mothers who are the victims of domestic violence are born already at a substantial disadvantage when it comes to their future earnings. So that was sort of the first.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously really astounding statistics and correlations. What are some of the other factors that you have studied that you have found that affect the possibility for children?
Yeah. So in other work that I did with Steve Yuka, who's an epidemiologist here at Brown, and Laura Stroud, who's a developmental psychologist, we looked at the impact of stress, right? So there's a lot of really interesting work being done in neurobiology, linking stress either in the in utero period or early childhood with worse outcomes. And much of that work is done with animals, right? Sort of in animal experiments. And you can see that sort of exposure to stress in utero in particular actually affects brain development and negatively affects the offspring's mental and motor development sort of later in life. And so we sort of took that to the data, it's sort of a really great data set that had siblings born to the same mom and followed them for many years afterwards. And one nice thing that this data set had was it had maternal serum that was collected when the mother was pregnant, which we then assayed for cortisol. What is cortisol? Cortisol is referred to as the stress hormone, and it's kind of a marker for the amount of stress the mother has been exposed to. And what we essentially found is when we compare siblings born to the same mom, the child that was born to a mother who had a much higher cortisol level had lower IQ, worse health, and fewer completed years of schooling in early adulthood, right? So being exposed to stress negatively affects the child's development relative to his sibling. And of course, this is not a surprise, poor moms are much more likely to be exposed to stress. There's so many more stressors in the lives of poor women relative to women who have resources. So not only do they experience more stress, I think one of the more interesting findings of the work was that conditional on the same level of stress, the consequences for the children of poor mothers were much worse. So the idea is even when a poor mother and a mother with resources face the same stressor, that mother with resources can buffer her child from the negative consequences of that stress in a way that a poor mother without resources cannot.
Well, a lot of that we also hear about, especially in cities and urban environments, Providence being one of them, is also the problems of environmental toxins.
Yeah.
So I was curious to hear how maybe your work and other economists' work has made sense of the environment relative to children's success.
That's great, yeah. So children's health is very sensitive to environmental pollutants, right? Air pollution in particular. Working with two pediatricians here at Brown, Patrick Vivier and Peter Simon, we got some really great data from the state of Rhode Island. The state of Rhode Island has been very aggressive in screening children for lead. And we screened about 80% of kids in the state for lead. And what we were able to do was get a data set that linked children's lead levels with their disciplinary records from school and records from the juvenile detention facility. And we have this for about 120,000 kids who were born in Rhode Island between 1990 and 2004. And you could find a very, very, very strong relationship between lead levels, which are measured between the ages of 0 and 6, and future disciplinary infractions, suspensions from school, and the probability of being detained as a juvenile. And what you see in Rhode Island, which you see sort of nationwide, is that poor children have much higher lead levels, and that's due to a number of reasons, but a big part of the story is the urban nature of their living, right? So urban environments have much higher levels of pollution, including lead, and that is this sort of the location of poor children is a big part of the story in terms of their much greater exposure to environmental contaminants. I mean, even within a city, though, there's also sort of huge differences. You look at a Superfund site, for example, right? Much more likely to be poor and minority families living around Superfund sites. As soon as that Superfund site gets cleaned up, the neighborhood immediately gets richer and whiter.
Well, I mean, all of these obviously are astounding findings. I know that you all have lots of questions, or I imagine you do. Maybe we can just touch on a couple more things before we move on. I was just wanting to ask a little bit more if there is anything in particular, any of the other factors we particularly looked at, but also just thinking a little bit more about this relationship between poor children and interactions with the juvenile justice system.
Right. So one of the more recent pieces that I've worked on is with an economist at MIT named Joe Doyle. And here we were interested in sort of what is the impact of juvenile incarceration on children's outcomes. So I'm going to show you one slide just to put this in perspective. Okay? This is juvenile incarceration or detention in the US relative to other countries, right? The next highest, right, so that's the US, so to the right. This is 336 per 100,000. The next the next highest country is South Africa at 69, right? So we're 5 times higher than that. So we're really very punitive when it comes to children, juveniles, and it's extremely costly. So it costs about between $100,000 and $200,000 a year to detain a juvenile. It costs about $30,000 for an adult. For juveniles, it's much more expensive. We're spending a tremendous amount of money detaining juveniles. So you have those sort of direct costs, but there are also sort of indirect costs. So Joe Doyle and I were sort of interested in, if you detain a juvenile, are you going to reduce his human capital? Will you reduce the likelihood that he completes high school, for example, right? So we got data from a large Midwestern city to try to answer this question. And this is sort of a complicated question because if I just look at the high school completion rate of children who are detained versus children who are not detained, you would bet that the children who are detained are going to have much lower rates of high school completion, right? They're much more likely to be poor and disadvantaged, and so they're going to be less likely to complete high school anyway, regardless of the detention status, right? So it's kind of a difficult question to determine whether or not there's in fact a causal relationship between detention and high school completion. So what you'd like to do is, as a scientist, is you'd like to do a randomization, right? So I'd like to randomize some kids to be detained and some kids not to be detained, right? This kind of randomized controlled trial, and then compare their outcomes at the end, right? The beauty of that is those kids are the same, right? Whether they got detained or not was just a function of luck. We don't have that, but we have something similar, which is there's a lot of randomness in the juvenile justice system, the criminal justice system more generally. The judge you receive is random. And in our data, there was huge variation in the propensity of judges to detain or incarcerate juveniles. So you could be lucky and you could get one of those judges that was very, very rarely detained a juvenile. Or you could be unlucky and get one of those judges who was much harsher and much more likely to detain a juvenile. And so we essentially exploited that. And even when you exploit that sort of randomness, you find that children who were detained are much less likely to graduate from high school. In fact, fewer than 1% graduate from high school if they've been detained in the juvenile detention facility. And they're much more likely to be found in the adult correctional system by the age of 25. So not only are there huge direct costs of detaining juveniles, there are very large indirect costs as well. And if you look at the data, there are basically only poor children in jail. So we do have data for the Rhode Island Training School, which is the state's juvenile detention facility. And virtually all of those children are free lunch children. There are no non-poor kids in the juvenile detention facility in the state of Rhode Island. And that is the same pretty much everywhere. So there's just sort of one other reason why growing up poor makes it much less likely that you will earn a lot in the labor force as an adult.
I had one other thought as you were explaining that last bit, and that is at the beginning you were talking about the way discrimination is hard to account for, but especially given racial tensions around policing in the U.S. In recent years, and historically, but it's come to a head again. How might, though, we might think about the question of discrimination in relation to policing in these neighborhoods? I mean, is there, how might an economist try to make sense of that?
That's an incredibly difficult question. I don't know that I have a good answer. I mean, I will say there is some evidence that areas in which the police are very aggressive, they are aggressive towards everybody, but those places tend to have a high share of African Americans. So does that make sense? So there is something about, maybe a place-based approach is the way to think about this. It is an incredibly difficult question, and the issue is, particularly when you're talking about children, the consequences of this are huge and long-lasting, right? So we should be getting this right.
Okay, so with that, we open up to questions. It might be helpful for the rest of the audience if you could use a mic. We have a couple of mics. We can pass them around, or you can go to the stand, because it's often hard for people to hear across this room. So just for the sake of everyone to speak into the mic.
Can I just speak up?
Yeah.
Okay. When I look at this chart, the shocking thing that I see is that if you look at guns per capita, it looks very similar. If you look at the U.S.,
Yeah.
it's 5 times more than many countries' guns per capita. So I wonder whether you've looked at that. And then I have 2 other questions. One is there any data that might show that the U.S. population is more aggressive than other populations or not? And then the other question is, why is the legal system doing this? Because my sense is that it's also our legal system that is causing this. And is there an explanation for that?
Yeah, okay, so these are all good questions. The question of guns, right? So unfortunately, there is not a lot of research on guns. And why is that? That is because the federal government does not want research on guns. The CDC used to have a huge research program on gun violence. They no longer do. So part of
Congress.
Yes, most likely, right? So unfortunately, we don't have a lot of research on guns. The little research that there is that I think is credible, there's an economist at Stanford named Mark Duggan who has done some work on this, and the title of his paper is More Guns, More Crime. He, in fact, finds a very strong relationship between the amount of guns on the streets, gun ownership, and crime rates. Others dispute that, but I think we really need more research in that area. For me, that is some of the most credible research that I've seen on the topic. It shows that there is this strong relationship. So your other question was about inequities in the justice system. That again, I don't know that there's been a lot of work in that area. I mean, I will say there is a recent book, not by an economist. His contention is the reason why we have so many people in jail is that we are unfair in our funding of prosecutors versus legal defense. So prosecutors have a tremendous advantage in terms of resources. And that's why we have this very skewed system. Again, I think it's somewhat compelling, his argument, but I don't know that that's, I don't know that we know the answer to that, actually.
Sure, thanks. Thank you. This is really, really compelling information. I'm thinking about in life sciences, for example, companies build diagnostics, and then the question is, okay, now we have this data. Will doctors take that data and will they apply it? Will they use it, or is it just a wasted test? So I look at this data that you have here, and I'm wondering how do you then take that to be applied to help people? And in your comment on federal government, maybe that's not where you start, but from a local perspective, can you get this into legislation? What do you do with it to make it meaningful?
Right. So actually, we're very fortunate. The beauty of one of the beautiful things about Rhode Island is a very small state, and we happen to be in the capital. And so I have been asked to testify in particular about my work on juvenile incarceration. So in the state of Rhode Island, for example, there is no minimum age at which a child can be detained in the state juvenile detention facility. And so somebody introduced legislation to just try to set a floor. And so I got to testify on behalf. Basically, I just sort of gave the results of my research. And afterwards, the senator who was holding the hearings, who was in charge of the subcommittee in charge, actually asked if I would come to talk to him in more detail in chambers about my research. And so I did. And so in a small state like Rhode Island, you can actually have these kinds of experiences. You have to be very careful, though, as a scientist, not to be seen as having a horse in the race, right? Because then you're not seen as objective in your work. So there has to be a fine balance between doing your work and being credible and having any kind of impact on policy. You have to be careful, I think, in that sense. But there are opportunities.
Question there, and then there's one.
On your prior slide, on the bottom left, you have a number of countries that I think are countries that have excellent educational systems, if I recollect. Have you looked at how the wage gap is tighter or smaller in those countries, and whether education or there are other factors through comparative analysis?
Education is absolutely a big part of this picture, absolutely. There are many people who just study the educational system. I've done some stuff on early education, so preschool, but I haven't done work myself on elementary, middle, and high school, but that is an incredibly important part of this story as well. Yeah, that's right.
In your studies, and I know you've taken on a lot to chew just with the gender issue, but do you also break it off into the intersectionality between race and gender and how those numbers might skew?
Yeah, so if you look, I'm interested in sort of childhood disadvantage more generally. 20% of children in the US are growing up poor. If you look at African American children, that's 40%. So you cannot take race out of this equation. It is obviously a very important part of this. I think the work in stress is probably very relevant. Actually, racism is incredibly stressful. And even if they've done sort of studies in labs where they will expose different subjects to different sort of videos and watch what happens to their heart rates and their cortisol levels. And when you expose people to sort of videos that display sort of racial or racism or racist behavior, I should say, it's a very stressful thing. Even though there's no direct, in that particular setting, it's just a laboratory, there's no direct effect on the subject. You see their heart rates, you see their cortisols go up. And so just imagine that for children. I mean, it's really, it's a big part of this story. So yeah, you can't ignore it. It's a big part of this.
Yeah. In your study, your slide on the wage gap by country, one of the things that it looked like was that the countries with the bigger wage gap are actually countries with stronger economies, and that seemed counterintuitive, and I was wondering why that might be. And conversely, the ones with kind of weak economies like Italy, Greece, Spain have the lower wage gap.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I'm thinking about the Great Recession that we had here in the U.S. I'm trying to think, did that hit women harder? I think it didn't. I think it hit men harder, actually. That's an astute observation. I'm not sure I have an answer for that. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question also about some of your colleagues who do work around IQ and the work that's being reconsidered around IQ being genetically determined and that being determinative of the things you were describing, like low birth weight or, so what are the debates that are going on in your field about what really is determinative of, outcomes like poverty?
Well, so IQ, you can sort of debate what it's actually measuring, but in any data set, and let me just step back 1 second. Among economists, I won't speak for all social scientists, the consensus is that IQ is something that is developed in early childhood, right? It is very much a function of your environment. Genetics is a piece of it, but environment is very important. That said, it's not clear exactly what IQ is measuring, but in any data set you look at, IQ is extremely predictive of wages, right? So again, without debating what it's actually capturing, it's a very important measure, right? It's very predictive of wages and employment and educational attainment and all those things.
So in that case, so the work that you've done, like on stress, which can be environmental neighborhood, it can be domestic violence in the home or even in utero, and then also the environmental factors, those are impacting IQ, right? However it is that it's developed. Like that, whether or not it's a developmental story of IQ or an innate one. So in either case, I guess what I'm saying is it sounds like what you were saying is the factors you've studied matter regardless of the account of IQ. Would that be?
They have effects on human capital. It has many dimensions to it. I think IQ, whatever it's measuring, is an important component of your human capital, but so is your health and your mental health and your soft skills, right? So human capital has many dimensions. IQ is one of them, again, without debating exactly what it's capturing, It's very predictive, and it is very much a function of your early childhood environment, right? It's not, if you are not, right, it is something that is developed in early childhood. It's something that we invest in.
Hi, for the gender gap in earnings, I'm wondering whether there's any difference between the public sector and the private sector.
Oh, in terms of the gender
The
wage gap?
Yes.
That's a good question. There was it's one slide, sorry, on, looked at teachers. I was sort of
Yeah, so the
surprised.
teacher is the smallest,
Yeah.
kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm wondering because of affirmative action in government agencies.
Well, I think it's also, I don't know that it's affirmative action so much as the public sector is highly unionized, and at this point that kind of regulates pay schedules in a
Yes.
way. So I think actually, at this point, within the unionized job, there's probably a lower gender wage gap.
Yeah, thanks.
Do you have a sense of what the annual earnings would have to be in different regions, obviously, that would determine whether or not someone is so poor that that poverty is causing stress? And is that correlated to work being done on minimum wage?
Oh, that's a good question. So I would say that we don't have the data that's good enough for that, right? So that's because measuring income is kind of hard. Income moves around a lot. What we tend to use instead is maternal education. And so the big difference is women who are high school dropouts. That's where you're seeing a lot of action. So where they are exactly, I mean, they are in the bottom of the range of the income distribution, but I couldn't be more specific than that, again, because the data is not really there.
Did you take into account whether any of these occupations were unionized or not?
Right, so that was a question that was raised before. For elementary and middle school teachers, that's typically a highly unionized sector. And you can see the gap there is 89%, which is lower than the gap more generally. So I think unionization actually serves to reduce the gap.
Still looking at that slide, I'm wondering if, because I'm looking at the gender gap for, it looks like elementary education and nursing, right, are the least. And I'm wondering what the effect of men entering like the so-called pink collar jobs has anything to do with why it might be less or not.
Oh, so you're saying nursing and teaching are sort of have historically or traditionally been...
Yes. And so now men are getting into that, and I'm wondering, maybe not even like if it's an effect, but what you're seeing as a result of that economically.
That's a good question. I have not looked at that myself, but it is surprising that in those two professions which are still dominated, have traditionally been dominated and are still dominated by women, you see a pay gap with men being paid more. It's interesting. I haven't studied it myself, but that would be good to look at. That'd be interesting to see how that's evolving over time as more men enter these professions. That's a good question.
I'm interested in your studies about lead and lead poisoning because, at some point in the past 25 years, we decided that, the levels of lead are intolerable. We have to address that among poor families. However, we found it to be a very strong indicator, maybe even causal. How has that affected your research?
So, I mean, what I was surprised by, well, there's a couple things. I was surprised that we still found these strong effects, even though we are at historically low lead levels, right? So that was sort of one piece that was somewhat surprising to me. I will also say, I probably should have shown a graph on this. One nice piece about that research was that at the beginning of the period, so the kids who were born in 1990, there was a huge gap in lead levels by both income and race, with poor kids and African-American kids having much higher lead levels. By the end of our period, so these were kids who were born in 2004, that gap had shrunk significantly. So over time, we're actually seeing, as we get rid of lead in the environment, basically what you're seeing is first the sort of more privileged children are benefiting, but eventually, right, the more disadvantaged kids catch up. It takes some time, but it does eventually happen.
Would you say that this, I mean, I'm guessing it's a combination, but is there any hard evidence about the effectiveness of, regulations for landlords, these kinds of things, and also the increased testing? Like, is it just also an awareness issue? Like, if someone knows that their child is being exposed to lead?
Yeah. So I would say in the, the medical profession has been taking lead seriously for a very long time. The medical profession has some clout. And I think they were very much behind, I can only speak for Rhode Island where I know, much of the legislation that required landlords to basically mitigate lead hazards. So actually it's been, not only was there federal legislation, which removed lead from gas and also household paint, you still have a lot of residual lead in the environment, and in fact the states sort of had to take that on. It's not a sort of federal effort, and the state of Rhode Island was very aggressive, and in part because of the research.
Is there a relationship between the unemployment rate and the pay gap? Is it stable over time?
That's a great question. Somebody suggested that, looking at strong economies and weak economies. I think I should have looked up what happened during the Great Recession, but I do believe that I wish I remember, I'm sorry. I do think there was a gendered, the response to the Great Recession did vary somewhat by gender. But that would be, yeah, I apologize, I don't know, I can't remember.
Yes, I wanted to go back to the incarceration part of your program. And due to the consequences of all those folks being incarcerated and not getting their proper education, and when you mentioned $200,000 a person, I think that certainly could be used to educate, and you now have them in a space that maybe you can, if you want to incarcerate them, but obviously it would be better if they didn't get to that point. But do you know of any alternative programs? I mean, there's a few that I know about that try to prevent that, but that seems actually a silly waste of resources.
So basically what we found in our data is, so most kids in our data set only were detained for about 3 to 4 months. But even that very short period of time was enough, because these kids were only sort of marginally attached to school before. And so if you take them out of school for 3 to 4 months, forget it. They're just never going back. You might think, well, maybe they'll go to school when they are detained, because the city, the state has to actually educate them. And all of the juvenile detention facilities have schools inside of them. But clearly they're not very effective. Right? So, yeah, I mean, it's just a law. It's just a huge waste.
Well, there are some that think there's a school-to-prison pipeline that is really based on racism, institutionalized and otherwise. I've heard of studies where even very, very young children are suspended from school, Latino and African-American kids, and first, second grade at huge and higher numbers than white kids, and this continues through middle and high school, and those are kids that then become disaffected with school, have loss of self-esteem, lose confidence, and those are the kids, so they say, I'm not an expert, that are more likely than not to end up in a juvenile justice system that itself has a lot of institutionalized racism within it, between judges and, as you said, prosecutors and resources. So are we talking then about a problem that really begins at kindergarten, first grade?
Yeah, that's a great question. In our data for Rhode Island, if you have been suspended from school, you are 10 times more likely to end up in the juvenile detention facility, right? So there's clearly a relationship there. Other people have studied this. I mean, partly it's a mechanical relationship. If you're not in school, you've been suspended for a week, you are outside without supervision, without any structure, interacting, you're much more likely to interact with the police, you're much more likely to get into trouble, right? So in some ways it's just mechanical, right? We're kicking kids out of school and putting them in an environment where they're at much greater risk for doing something that might get them in trouble, for interacting with the police, et cetera. So this issue of the sort of school to prison pipeline, I think is very relevant. I do think that there is greater awareness of that now among educators, and don't know what they're doing about it. You are seeing more and more police officers in school, not fewer. So, yeah. Yeah, right.
So I think we have time for maybe one more question, and then we have a reception afterwards, and we can continue the conversation.
You showed us really interesting trends about differences in wages and how they change over time.
Yep.
But what about whether all of these issues that these kids are facing are improving or getting worse? And, you know, like, I get a feeling that the increased inequalities may be a big cause of this. And also, if you could talk a little bit about the globalization, you know, topic that is so prevalent now, whether that has anything to do with this.
Okay, so are things getting better or worse? I will say, actually, we are getting more unequal. The evidence is not there that we are getting less mobile. In fact, we've been increasing in terms of our inequality in the US pretty consistently since about 1976, right? And during that time, we have always been immobile, but we're not getting more, we're not getting worse. So I'm not sure, you know, you see it in the cross-section, right? Countries that are more unequal are more immobile, but within a country over time, we're not seeing that, at least not in the US. So, right? I mean, but at the same time, it's hard to imagine that we're going to get more mobile if we get more unequal.
Yeah.
Right?
Maybe one more.
Well, is anyone then studying the people who are poor and who end up being the most mobile and making it?
Yeah.
What are the drivers?
That's a great question. Actually, I have a colleague named John Friedman, and he has been working on these issues in particular. What he's doing with an economist at Stanford named Raj Chetty is they're looking at neighborhoods that seem to really work. Neighborhoods where poor kids end up doing well. Salt Lake City, who knew? Poor kids there do really well. And, you know, so what they're trying to do is sort of figure out what it is about those neighborhoods. It's a new initiative. It has a name. I think it's called Climb. And they will soon have an internet presence if they don't already, where they'll be sort of producing work and research in this area. So more to come.
Okay, well, join me in thanking Professor Aizer for her fascinating work.